Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to our next installment of the presidential series, part 2, taking a look at our 32nd president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Good old FDR. As I said in part 1, I am flying solo for the audio portion. You might get some guest appearances from good old Henry, but he's not a big fan of doing the audio, which, I mean, I understand, a 7-year-old's attention span. I get it. So, part 1, as we all know, took a look at the birthplace and the youth and the, education and early political career of FDR, as we always do. And that was a little bit of a longer part 1, almost about an hour in length. Now, part 2, who knows? I think it'll be around an hour, but I mean, it could be a bit longer than that because I would like to just do FDR in 2 parts, but if it's going to take 3 parts, we will find out. So, I'm going to jump right in here. Of course, as I always like to do, I always like to take a look at the election, that obviously won the presidency for whatever person we're covering that week. And this would be, of course, the 1932 presidential election. This was obviously Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 as the Democrat going up against the incumbent Republican Herbert Hoover, president. And it wasn't even close. Literally was not even close. So just to give you an idea, FDR won 42 of 48 states. Hoover only won 6 states, and the electoral vote was 472 to 59 in favor of FDR. FDR carried 57.4% of the popular vote. So, as you're seeing here, you're probably seeing some maps of the 1932 election and that sort of thing. It wasn't even close. It really wasn't. It was pretty handily won. The Democratic ticket that year was, of course, FDR for president. And then his vice president was John Nance Garner, who was the 39th Speaker of the House from 1931 to 1933. So John Nance Garner there, he was the vice president for his first term, at least, for FDR's first term. So there you go. The 1932 presidential election, a landslide win for FDR. Again, not even close. The country was obviously in the midst of the Great Depression. The country was not happy with the way Herbert Hoover handled things. And I think even more so than just the fact of they were not satisfied with the way Hoover handled the Great Depression, I feel that there was probably a lot of Americans who were suffering and struggling tremendously during the Great Depression that blamed Hoover, and even if it wasn't all his fault, which really wasn't all his fault, that was just the easiest person to blame. The President of the United States is the, easiest way to point the finger at, the person to point the finger at. So I think they obviously took it out on him in the polls, and it shows. So there you go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to FDR's presidency, his legacy. I'm going to give you an overview synopsis of his presidency like I always tend to do. And then there's going to be a lot of fun facts. I am going to warn you guys because I did write myself a bunch of notes like I always do, and there's a ton of notes for FDR. So there may be things that I repeat, from different sources and that sort of thing. So I'll try to limit that as much as I can to repeating myself. But first, we'll start off with the synopsis of his presidency, and then we'll go from there. So here we go. Jumping into the presidency of FDR, the very long presidency. In fact, I think he's still president. I always make the joke with people that, I think it's like Weekend at Bernie's. If anybody remembers that movie, Weekend at Bernie's, where they prop the dead guy up and act like he's still alive. I think that's what they would do with FDR. He was so popular, so pretty crazy. So here we go. As America's desperation increased, the people searched for an answer. They would find it in a man who defied his own physical limitations and would lift the spirit of the country while shaping the presidency for decades to come. On March 4th of 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt arrived at the Capitol to take the oath of office and become the 32nd President of the United States. Unable to walk independently after a 13-year battle with polio, Roosevelt wore leg braces under his pants, but was still able to take a few short but sturdy steps to the podium. It had been raining for the week before the inauguration in Washington, D.C., and as he is coming to take the oath of office, the sun literally did come out. Before a crowd of 100,000 at the Capitol and tens of millions on the radio, FDR recited the 35-word oath by heart and then gave one of the most memorable speeches ever delivered by a president. After years of economic spiral and something close to despair, when millions of Americans had basically abandoned hope about the future, this man came out of nowhere and in the course of a speech, one speech, began to address the psychological needs of the country. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Preeminently the time to speak the truth frankly and boldly, nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into...
A critical aspect of any president is to engender confidence. It was critical that the American people could hear him say, hey, there are folks here in Washington who are going to take charge. FDR was following through on his mandate from the 1932 election, promising a new deal for the American people. He had carried 42 states and 57% of the popular vote. In Congress, Republicans lost over 100 seats to the Democrats, the biggest congressional shift in nearly 40 years, giving Roosevelt a solid majority to work with in both the House and the Senate. But he was vague on how he was going to use it. Franklin Roosevelt came into office with a great deal of hope. No one knew precisely what Roosevelt would do. Roosevelt believed in action for the sake of action. Even if it's wrong, it's okay. The humorist Will Rogers said, you know, if he'd burned down the Capitol or the White House, we would have said, good. At least he got a fire started anyhow. This is how cold and bad it felt in 1932. The first thing he did was declare a bank holiday, basically to shut down the banks all over the country. There was serious question whether this was constitutional, and Americans were alarmed enough that they were willing to go along with it. Then, the next thing he did was to figure out a way of preserving the banking system more or less as it existed. 10,000 banks had failed since 1929. With the Congress solidly behind him, Roosevelt pushed through the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which reorganized the banking system and most importantly, federally guaranteed deposits for the first time. The next morning, when the banks started to open, lines again began to form outside the banks. But now people lined up to put their money in banks. And within a space of only 2 weeks, the banking crisis was resolved. Roosevelt also realized he needed something that would provide comfort to Americans. So he signed a bill re-legalizing certain alcohol sales, saying, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." On April 7th, thousands lined up outside of taverns and distilleries to enjoy their first legal drink in 14 years. Roosevelt had that cheer as a leader, and that was important to the voter, especially in the Depression. The first 100 days is probably the most storied period of presidential success in Congress in all of American history. In effect, he got his brain trust together and they hastily wrote legislation and he sent it to Congress. Boom, 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 and they passed it. Major pieces of legislation after major piece of legislation. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt displayed a passion and a commitment to finding solutions for every aspect of the Depression. Roosevelt revealed the same qualities in dealing with the Depression that he had once used in trying to deal with polio. It was a sense of determination, an unbound optimism, a willingness to experiment with different ideas. I mean, this really becomes the hallmark of his style of government. But above all, what he did was he established, as Andrew Jackson had 100 years earlier, as Abraham Lincoln had at the time of Fort Sumter, great leaders do not manage a crisis. They frankly use the crisis to establish an emotional bond with the American people. Roosevelt was deeply concerned that he had been seen as a pillar of strength, that he be seen as a pillar of strength for the country. So he carefully crafted his image for the public eye. Anybody who met him was shocked when they saw him in a wheelchair, because there were only 2 pictures that show him in the wheelchair that he used every day. And neither of those pictures were printed while he was alive. FDR soon realized his real power lay in being heard, not seen. While Harding in 1922 was the first president to be heard on the radio, and Coolidge a year later, the first to make regular radio speeches, Roosevelt mastered the medium through radio addresses every week, his fireside chats.
You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot...
My friends, you and I agree that security is our greatest need. The chance to work, the opportunity of making a reasonable profit in our business. There is this immediate magnetism, and the White House is just flooded with letters. Suddenly, they have to hire dozens of people to handle this immense volume of mail that comes in. There is something about the radio that makes people feel more connected and want to reach out and respond. FDR's approach was an enormous success. Though the country was still in the Depression, still struggling with double-digit unemployment, the American people were confident in their president. In the 1936 election, they gave Roosevelt the biggest landslide victory in presidential history. 46 of 48 states. And with that, FDR's confidence swelled. So just to give you a little bit of a brief thing about the 36 election, yes, he carried 46 of 48 states. He went up against a man by the name of Alf Landon, who was the Republican from Kansas. And yeah, it was almost 61% of the popular vote went to Roosevelt. Listen to this. The electoral vote was 523 to 8. Yeah, you heard me. To 8. So yes, it was the biggest landslide victory of all time. It was unbelievable. It was not even close. Wasn't even a contest. That was the 36th presidential election. And after he won that, as I said, FDR's confidence swelled. FDR considered himself one of the two great actors in America. He said the other one was Orson Welles. So he knew that there was theater to this. The presidency is a theater. You have to be able to project in the theater of the presidency or you won't succeed. But Roosevelt's act was wearing thin with the other two branches of government. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled that FDR's National Recovery Act, which would have given him the power to regulate any industry in the country, was unconstitutional. Frustrated, Roosevelt fought back by trying to get control over the Supreme Court. Franklin Roosevelt commits perhaps the greatest political mistake of his presidency. That is, he tries to pack the Supreme Court or to add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. But the American public had this instinctive sense and respect for the separation of powers. They did not want the president encroaching on what they believed to be the turf, the prerogative of the Supreme Court. So there was a backlash. His own party refused to support the bill and served FDR notice that even for him, there were limits to presidential power. The news got worse for Roosevelt, and the nation, as his New Deal policies could not stop yet another economic collapse. There was abiding unemployment, double-digit unemployment most of the 1930s. Instead of recovery, there was a depression within the depression. That emboldened his critics, particularly conservatives, to argue that Roosevelt and the New Deal had prolonged rather than solved the Great Depression. With backlash against FDR building, Republicans and conservative Democrats made significant gains in midterm elections, and by 1938, the New Deal looked all but dead. In the end, what would enable Roosevelt to resurrect his power and lift the country out of its economic woes was war. President Franklin Roosevelt's days were always rigidly scheduled. He was up at 8 a.m., he read as many as a dozen papers with his breakfast before receiving a morning briefing. From 10:30 a.m. on, he was working, taking meetings, receiving visitors. Meals, often with guests, were important to him, though the guests could hardly understand why. The food was terrible. The cook was a woman named HENRIETTA NESBITT, and she was so bad, her food was so watery, that when people would be invited over to the White House for dinner, they would remind each other to eat first before they got there. FDR entertained often at the mansion, but he encouraged his First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to take on a much more meaningful role than hostess. Eleanor Roosevelt was the most important and effective First Lady in American history. Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt had this interesting alliance almost a tag team, and he was quite happy for her to have that reputation. Eleanor frequently traveled making speeches and representing the president at public events. When the First Lady returned, she would leave FDR reports in a little basket by his bedside. What she goes back to report on are class conflicts and labor issues and race issues. So she really came into the White House with a fairly radical political agenda, but it hides it under all of it under this veil of, I am just going to be his eyes and ears. Through his first 8 years in office, Franklin Roosevelt had been spending most of his time focused on fixing America's domestic problems. But that would come to an abrupt halt in 1940. In the midst of Nazi aggression in Europe, and with Japan beating war drums in the Pacific, the ominous atmosphere led FDR to make a controversial decision for that year's election. He decided that he would seek a third term. At the Democratic Convention, there were even a lot of Democrats who wore buttons, "No third term." A lot of people who were on his team thought it was offensive to violate this George Washington tradition. Roosevelt privately said that the country could not stay out of the war forever, but at a campaign speech in Boston, he insisted the conflict was not on his agenda. He says at this speech in Boston, I have said it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into a foreign war.
I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
And he knew it was a lie, but he needed to do it in order to win election. He felt that it would be a total disaster for the country if an isolationist Republican became president. He did not trust any of his lieutenants in the Democratic Party to be as good as he was, and that was part of his own confidence in himself. Despite any misgivings about Roosevelt's intentions, 38 states and 55% of the popular vote broke for FDR and ended the 144-year-old precedent of a two-term limit set by George Washington. Forced to face an isolationist Congress, the president could only prepare the nation for war, not declare it. He doubled the size of the Navy, he instituted a draft, and he threw the country's support to Britain. Now, just to give you guys an idea real quick of the 1940 election, that was his third term that we just briefly touched on. Again, not very close at all. Roosevelt went up against the Republican by the name of Wendell Willkie, also from New York. Roosevelt won the electoral vote 449 to 82. Roosevelt carried 38 of 48 states. Willkie only won 10. And Roosevelt won 54.7% of the popular vote, almost 55% of the popular vote. It was only a few Midwest states, and of course, I believe it's Maine and Vermont. That was it. Everything else went to Roosevelt. So Roosevelt won fairly handily again, even in the 1940 election, which now started his third consecutive term in office. Unprecedented, as we just discussed. So moving on. Roosevelt was good at war. He was a great sailor. He knew every crack and crevice of the East Coast and could sail it personally, no matter what size the craft. And he was turning away from economics to foreign policy, which he was a master of. The United States, under Roosevelt's leadership, becomes what was called the arsenal of democracy. We provided the arms that helped Great Britain hold off Nazi Germany. FDR did everything in his power as Commander-in-Chief to help the Allies, ordering U.S. ships to patrol the North Atlantic and escort British vessels. It would take a surprise attack to finally convince the rest of the country that U.S. participation in the war could not be avoided. It really was not until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that the country had a consensus that there was no choice. We had to go to war. And Roosevelt asked for a declaration of war. Of course, as we know, a day that will live in infamy.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
It is World War II that ends the Great Depression in the United States, and specifically the enormous federal spending on the war. The war becomes the stimulus program or package, if you will, that not even the New Deal could accomplish. Far more was spent on the war that had been spent on the New Deal projects of the 1930s. You see, the government becoming more than 30% of the economy, which was stunning. He knew that he needed businesses to help him with war, to build the ships, and called them allies in the actual war itself. As the nation went to work to supply the war effort, Roosevelt turned the White House into a fortified bunker and military headquarters. As late as the morning of December 7th of 1941, the White House was still a fairly casual place. However, after the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, the White House became the fortress we know it today. Sentry posts went up, guards surrounded the White House, the president's personal security detail went from 25 to over 100. The windows of the mansion were blacked out, and the Secret Service proposed machine gun emplacements be positioned on the roof. FDR rejected the guns, but he did allow a bomb shelter to be built under the East Wing, and the nation's nerve center to be moved from his study on the second floor to the map room on the ground floor. The Great Depression seemed to become a distant memory. The people and their president had just one focus: victory. In 1942, Washington, D.C. was swelling in size as it prepared for the war. Temporary buildings surrounded the National Mall, and air raid shelters popped up all over the city. The largest office building in the world, the Pentagon, was under construction. And the changes in the president's house were harbingers of further changes Roosevelt had in mind. The best example of this is that Franklin Roosevelt has to dramatically increase the size of the staff dedicated to the president. FDR has already increased the number of personnel in the executive office to over 600 people, up from the roughly 100 under Coolidge and Hoover. But as the war took hold, the staff increased to monumental levels. At its peak, 194,000 people were employed by the executive office to assist in the war effort. After 9/11, George W. Bush had fewer than 2,000. Take that into contrast. The Roosevelt administration marks the beginning of what historians consider the national security state. He needs intelligence information about what is happening overseas, and that will become the CIA. And it is Franklin Roosevelt who turns domestic counterintelligence duties over to the FBI. So he is able to grasp incredible power. Whatever he wants, he gets. Congress is going to give him whatever he wants because Congress is frightened too. So it allows him to really increase the size of the presidency and to change America. Throughout World War II, FDR described himself as a juggler. I never let my right hand know what my left hand does. He kept Congress, his cabinet, and even the press off balance. FDR called the shots. He controlled the entire process. Indeed, he controlled the press. He had regular press conferences for the morning newspapers and the afternoon newspapers. He decided what was on the record, what was background, and what was absolutely off the record. And astonishingly, in 12 years, his decisions were almost never violated by the reporters. Franklin Roosevelt installs the White House taping system. He was concerned there would actually be a backstop, a way of determining what was said. It was a way, in a sense, of disciplining people who met with him. They would know that they could not make claims that were not true or hold the president to promises that he had not made. In 1942, Franklin Roosevelt's power reached a dangerous precipice. He signed one of the most controversial orders of his administration, the relocation and internment of more than 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent. Japanese American internment was one of the great flaws or mistakes of the Roosevelt presidency. It was popular at the time. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled that in a time of crisis, it was acceptable and constitutional for the president to do what he did. But truly, it was despicable. It is the one big blemish, in my opinion, of the FDR presidency. It was not a pleasant thing that he did. But by 1944, the war had turned in the Allies' favor. Roosevelt, though beginning to look haggard and weak, reluctantly agreed to run for a fourth term. He believed that he had to see the war through to the end. If Roosevelt and Churchill and the other Allied leaders had decided to settle instead of go for unconditional surrender, we would have had many more regions of the world that were under the cloak of fascism. Nearing victory, Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, nicknamed the Big Three, began planning the future of the post-war world. FDR hoped a new international organization would pave the way for a permanent global peace. The United Nations is really the League of Nations 2.0. People say, well, maybe if we had not forsaken the League of Nations, this could have been avoided. So there is this huge rush to go into a United Nations. And by God, we have got to win the peace this time, because that last time was so damn horrible. At the Yalta Conference, an exhausted and weakened FDR was certain that he and Winston Churchill had secured democracy for all of Europe. But Joseph Stalin had a different idea. Stalin thought that Eastern Europe would belong to him. And within 3 months, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain was dividing Eastern Europe from the West. On April 12th of 1945, a little more than a month after his fourth inauguration, the 63-year-old Franklin Roosevelt died at his vacation home in Warm Springs, Georgia. He had spent 4,422 days in office, more than any other president. The country was in a state of shock, a state of mourning. Many people assumed Roosevelt would be president forever. As the president's body was brought back to Washington by train, thousands lined the tracks to pay their final respects to a man who had come into and shaped their lives as no president had before. Winston Churchill compared meeting Franklin Roosevelt to opening your first bottle of champagne. He just made you feel better when you listened to him. He was arguably the most consequential person of the 20th century because first, he saved capitalism, and then he helped save democracy. And there is no denying the New Deal, which revolutionized the way politics worked in the 20th century. If Abraham Lincoln is the great architect of federal power of the 19th century, then FDR is for the 20th century. Now, in the long run, Franklin Roosevelt will also raise expectations that future presidents will struggle to meet. The American people will now look to Washington in times of crisis. They will look to the president to take care of them, to solve their problems, and often, Washington is not able to handle their problems. The president is not able to take care of what individuals need. The United States emerged from the war with a new mindset. Gone was the country's isolationist spirit. In its place was the desire to become a true superpower with wide influence over the entire globe. But that power would not go unchecked. The nation would find a rival, one that would test the mettle of its presidents like never before, with the constant threat of nuclear war. So there you go. That was kind of an overview of the presidency, of course, of Franklin Roosevelt. One thing I did want to touch on, because we briefly touched on it when I was, going over that synopsis and overview of his presidency, is his fourth term in the 1944 presidential election. The 1944 presidential election was Franklin Roosevelt. He actually went up against Thomas Dewey. Yes, the famed Thomas Dewey, very famous for the Truman, Dewey defeats Truman newspaper headline. So that Thomas Dewey. And Roosevelt beat him pretty handily. Not nearly as handily as other times, but he still beat him very handily. 432 electoral votes to 99. Roosevelt carried 36 states. Dewey only carried 12. And it was 53.4% of the popular vote went to Roosevelt. And on this ticket, for his fourth term, his vice president would happen to be Harry Truman. So FDR's vice presidential candidate that would become his vice president for his fourth term was Harry Truman. So that was the 1944 election. Won pretty handily over Thomas Dewey. And, of course, Truman was his vice president then for his fourth term. It's crazy to think, fourth term. It really is truly remarkable, really, when you stop and think about it. Another thing I wanted to touch on in the 1940 election that we already discussed, when he was elected for his third straight term, FDR, his vice president then with him was Henry A. Wallace, who was the 11th U.S. Secretary of Agriculture from 1933 to 1940. So I did want to mention that. And then also, we touched on earlier the 1936 election. That's when he won re-election during his second term. His vice presidential candidate for his second term in the 36 election was John Nance Garner. So just so everybody knows. So I just wanted to touch on that stuff. Always like to kind of go over those things with people. John Nance Garner, who actually was his vice president for his first term and his second term. And then he had a different one for his third term that we just said, Wallace. And then he had, of course, Truman for his final term. So pretty interesting stuff. It really is. So there you go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into some fun facts about FDR. Some things that I probably already touched on. Some things I probably have not touched on yet. And then, of course, we'll read about his death and his burial and that sort of thing. Okay, so let me see here what I can kind of tell you guys. FDR won all of his presidential elections in landslides in what came to be called the New Deal Coalition. Groups such as Southern whites, Catholics, Jews, African Americans, labor union members and small farmers united to comfortably elect Roosevelt to 4 terms in the White House. During his first presidential race in 1932, with the Great Depression at its height, he defeated unpopular incumbent Herbert Hoover by an electoral tally of 472 to 59. He then vanquished Kansas Governor Alf Landon in 1936, 523 electoral votes to 8. Businessman Wendell Willkie in 1940, 449 electoral votes to 82. And then New York Governor Thomas Dewey in 1944, 432 electoral votes to 99, winning at least 53.4% of the popular vote each time. So yeah, wasn't very hard for him to keep getting reelected. Pretty interesting. And then, of course, no president will ever serve longer, barring some sort of constitutional change, of course. When George Washington decided in 1796 that 8 years in office was enough, he established an unwritten rule that would stand for nearly a century and a half. A few presidents, including Theodore Roosevelt, tried to buck this precedent, but none succeeded until FDR, who ran for a 3rd term in 1940, largely over concerns about the growing threat from Nazi Germany. In the end, he served in the White House for more than 12 years, a feat his political opponents disparaged as bad for democracy. With Roosevelt's tenure in mind, momentum grew for the 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, which declared no person shall be elected president more than twice. So there you go. He basically started the change of that. And then, as I touched on before, his handicap was largely concealed from the public. In the summer of 1921, while on vacation in Canada, the 39-year-old Roosevelt fell ill with what was ultimately diagnosed as polio, a disease with no known cure. Paralyzed from the waist down, he underwent years of painstaking physical rehabilitation to try and regain the use of his legs. Yet, although he made some progress, learning to move short distances with the help of steel leg braces and a cane, usually while holding the arm of a companion, he would remain wheelchair dependent for the rest of his life. FDR could not even dress or bathe himself. The public never knew the full extent of his disability, however, in part because the media rarely mentioned it. At Roosevelt's request, most images from the time show him seated in an open car or standing at a podium. When the occasional photographer did try to catch him in his wheelchair, Secret Service agents reportedly tore the film out of their cameras. So, pretty crazy stuff there. Pretty crazy stuff. Historians tend to divide his New Deal into 2 parts. In his 1932 speech accepting the Democratic nomination for president, Roosevelt famously promised to tackle the Great Depression with a New Deal for the American people. Wasting no time, he initiated a flurry of legislation during his first 100 days in office, much of which remains in effect to this day. To shore up the faltering financial sector, FDR closed insolvent banks and reorganized others, federally insured bank deposits, established stock market regulations, and abandoned the gold standard. He also took steps to end prohibition, to increase employment throughout large-scale public works projects, to institute agricultural subsidies, and to bring electricity to rural areas. Related measures continued to pass throughout the rest of 1933 and 1934, after which Roosevelt took the New Deal in a more liberal direction, generally referred to as the Second New Deal. This time around, Congress raised taxes on the wealthy, guaranteed labor unions the right to collectively bargain, and approved unemployment and disability benefits, as well as Social Security for retirees. Try as he might, though, Roosevelt could not fully pull the country out of the Depression until it began mobilizing for World War II. There you have that. We touched on this a little. Roosevelt tried to increase the size of the Supreme Court. Fed up with the U.S. Supreme Court for striking down several New Deal laws, Roosevelt in early 1937 proposed expanding it from 9 to as many as 15 justices. Under this so-called court packing plan, which critics derided as a separation of powers violation, A new justice would be added for each sitting justice above the age of 70 who refused to retire. But although FDR's fellow Democrats held large majorities in both houses of Congress, they for once balked at supporting his agenda. In losing the battle, though, Roosevelt won the war. Never again would the Supreme Court invalidate a piece of New Deal legislation, and by the time of his death, 7 of the 9 justices were his appointees. There you go. So he ended up winning in the end. And yes, unfortunately, we touched on this. He sanctioned the imprisonment of Japanese Americans. Terribly. Anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States reached a fever pitch following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. In California, for example, the governor, the entire congressional delegation, numerous newspapers, and top U.S. Army commanders all called for Japanese residents to be removed so that they could not commit acts of espionage and sabotage. Some government officials had misgivings about what's now considered one of the most shameful episodes in U.S. history. But not Roosevelt, a humanitarian in many other respects, who told the War Department to do what it thought best. In February of 1942, he signed an executive order delineating military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. About 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were American citizens, were then forcibly removed to internment camps. Their property sold off at bargain basement prices. German Americans and Italian Americans were generally spared this fate. A few decades later, Congress issued a formal apology and awarded $20,000 to each surviving detainee. Really terrible. The worst thing that Roosevelt did, no doubt. It's not even debatable. Really bad. Another interesting, cool thing, FDR was the first sitting president to fly in a plane. At a time when air travel was much more dangerous, Roosevelt flew to Chicago in 1932 to accept the Democratic nomination for president. He then became the first sitting president to journey via airplane, and the first sitting president to leave the country in wartime, when he took off from Miami in January of 1943 aboard a Boeing 314 flying boat. After making stops in Trinidad, Brazil, and Gambia, he got on a second plane, a TWA C-54, which brought him to Casablanca, Morocco, for a conference with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. More flights followed, including one from Malta to the Soviet Union just a couple of months before his death. So pretty cool stuff. First sitting president ever to fly in a plane while he was sitting president. Pretty cool. So pretty remarkable things. We're going to continue on with some fun facts about FDR. Maine and Vermont were the only 2 states that never voted for FDR. Landslides became FDR's specialty. When Roosevelt defeated Hoover in the 1932 presidential election, he earned 472 Electoral College votes to Hoover's 59. The next race was even more lopsided. 531 votes were up for grabs that year, and Roosevelt claimed 523. He scored 2 more blowout victories in 1940 and 1944. Of the 48 states that existed at the time, Alaska and Hawaii didn't join the Union until 1959, of course. 46 voted for FDR at least once, but he never won Maine or Vermont. They backed the Republican nominee in all 4 races. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Maine and Vermont never voted for FDR during all of those elections. Thought that was interesting. Another really cool, fun story. When Fidel Castro was only 14 years old, he petitioned Franklin Roosevelt for $10. "My good friend Roosevelt, I don't know very English, but I know as much as I write to you." So begins a handwritten letter to the White House received from Cuba's eventual dictator back in 1940. Castro was a teen at the time, but already ambitious. He asked FDR for a $10 Bill Green American, because I would like to have one of them. As a postscript, Castro offered to show Roosevelt the biggest minas of iron in Cuba. Pretty interesting. I thought this was awesome. I didn't know this actually until I really started reading more about Roosevelt. I knew a lot about Roosevelt, but not this. Franklin Roosevelt was almost assassinated. During a Miami rally held on February 15th of 1933, less than a month before Roosevelt's first term began, former bricklayer Giuseppe Zangara fired at FDR with a cheap revolver. "I like Roosevelt personally, but I don't like presidents," he claimed. Zangara shot 5 people attending the event, including Chicago Mayor Anton CERMAK, before he was subdued. He missed Roosevelt entirely. So yes, Giuseppe Zangara, I was actually, just so everyone knows, I was going to go drive down to Florida to see Giuseppe Zangara's gravesite. He's actually buried at the Florida State Prison Cemetery. It's in northern Florida. It's a little bit south of Jacksonville. I forgot the exact town it's in, but I was going to drive. I literally looked into it. It's like 13 hours one way from my house, and I was like, I really could do that. I don't even have to stop. I could just do it all in one shot. But then I decided that was a little insane. So, but I did consider it, I have to tell you. But yes, Roosevelt, there was an assassination attempt on his life. So, interesting stuff. All right, moving on to some more here. Franklin Roosevelt established the White House's movie theater. You ever watch The West Wing? The movie theater at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue that Jed Bartlett, who was Martin Sheen, uses in Season 2 is 100% real. It's called the White House Family Theater, and FDR had it converted from an old cloakroom in 1942. Records show that Dwight D. Eisenhower watched more than 200 Westerns there. Thought that was cool. Interesting, fun stuff. Theodore Roosevelt's eldest son opposed Franklin Roosevelt in 2 elections. The 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, left office in 1909. While he and FDR shared many opinions, the Bull Moose and his family were Republicans, while Franklin, TR's 5th cousin, was a lifelong Democrat. Naturally, that produced some tension when FDR entered politics. Teddy Roosevelt's oldest son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., spoke out against his office-seeking relative in the elections of 1920 and 1932. "Franklin is such poor stuff," said the younger Theodore. "It seems improbable that he should be elected president." So, pretty crazy. Interesting. Franklin Roosevelt gave Major League Baseball the green light in World War II. Japanese forces suddenly attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. The unexpected blow propelled the U.S. into World War II and left baseball commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis with a tough decision. Now that the country was at war, should he suspend America's pastime and put pro baseball on hold for the duration? FDR didn't think so. He wrote Landis on January 15th of 1942. The president said, "I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going," noting that there will be fewer people unemployed and everybody will work longer hours and harder than ever before. Roosevelt believed Americans deserved a chance for recreation and for taking their minds off work. Known as the Green Light Letter, this dispatch from FDR emboldened Major League Baseball to carry on for 4 seasons during the war, although hundreds of players left to join the military. Franklin Roosevelt considered Japanese internment camps long before Pearl Harbor. Executive Order 9066, signed by the President on February 19th of 1942, authorized the removal of some 110 to 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes. They were forcibly detained in remote camps scattered across the United States. Very few politicians voiced opposition to the mass internment while it was happening. a congressional panel would eventually denounce it as a grave injustice in 1989. Roosevelt had considered the idea for years, believing a war between the U.S. and the Empire of Japan was likely. He suggested making a special list of Japanese citizens and non-citizens on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, who would be the first to be placed in a concentration camp in the event of trouble in 1936. Intelligence agencies monitored Japanese Americans throughout the late 1930s. Pretty crazy, pretty terrible stuff, to be honest. Franklin Roosevelt appointed the first woman to serve in the U.S. cabinet. Frances Perkins was sworn in as the new Secretary of Labor on March 4th of 1933 and retained the position for 12 years. Perkins, an architect of the New Deal, had already been working for Roosevelt. She was appointed commissioner of the New York Department of Labor in 1929 during FDR's tenure as the state's governor. She was selected as Secretary of Labor, first woman to hold a cabinet post in a U.S. presidential administration. She was instrumental in helping Roosevelt with many of his programs, including Social Security. This was the second time FDR had tapped Perkins for a government post. As governor of New York, he picked her to be the state's labor commissioner. Frances Perkins is interesting because she really was the mastermind behind Social Security, and she was very, very instrumental and influential on unemployment insurance. So, very smart lady. Very cool. Franklin Delano Roosevelt set up a polio rehab center in Georgia. Roosevelt was just 39 years old when he was diagnosed with polio in the summer of 1921. The virus left him paralyzed from the waist down, and he was fitted for leg braces the next year. Putting ambition aside, Roosevelt temporarily retired from politics to focus on his health. One day, philanthropist George Foster Peabody told him about a resort he owned in Warm Springs, Georgia, whose pools had allegedly cured a young polio victim. FDR soon became a regular guest. Then he bought the property off Peabody for $20,000 in 1926. On site, Roosevelt established the nonprofit Warm Springs Foundation, cited by the National Park Service as the first and for many years the only hospital devoted solely to the treatment of polio victims in the world. So, pretty cool. Pretty cool stuff there. Let's see what other really cool fun facts I can tell you about Eleanor. His wife set the modern precedent for first ladies. Eleanor Roosevelt first met FDR when she was 15 years old at a Christmas party, where he asked her to dance. She would remain in the family after marrying her distant cousin and helping to propel him past personal demons and physical limitations to become one of the greatest presidents that ever lived. On her own, she wrote My Day, a syndicated newspaper column that added a woman's voice to the collective power stemming from Washington. Rather than remain just a campaign accessory, the president watched as his wife protested segregation laws, welcomed women to the White House, and held surahs of free-thinking women throughout their time in Washington. Roosevelt would be the first president to name a woman to his cabinet. So yeah, she was very influential, probably the greatest first lady of all time, and the most influential, that's for sure. He will always hold the record for the longest tenure in White House. We know that, of course. All right, moving on. Let's see what else I got here for you guys. He dropped out of law school. We know all that from the first thing. Frances Perkins, we know. We know about him being the longest tenured president. Let's see, 10 things we did not know possibly about him. Oh, here we go. FDR's nickname was the Sphinx. While FDR is already on point in terms of a nickname, journalists stepped up their game in the late 1930s and branded him the Sphinx, since he refused to say whether he'd run for a third term in 1940. As a result, an 8-foot papier-mâché sculpture of FDR as the Sphinx was made in 1939 and was the centerpiece for the White House Press Correspondents' Dinner. And it still exists. So pretty cool thing there. Another cool thing, FDR designed a special car that allowed him to drive without the use of his legs. After polio paralyzed him from the waist down, FDR headed to recover in Warm Springs, Georgia, where he designed a mechanism for his car that would allow him to drive without the use of his legs. Also included, an automatic cigarette dispenser that puts our satellite radio systems to shame. Pretty cool. His alleged affairs were likely more emotional than physical. As reminded by Hyde Park historian David Woolner, FDR's condition likely prevented him from having any physical affairs with anybody, including his cousin Daisy, who he was quite close with. There is no evidence in the historical record of a physical relationship with those women, he said. None. Zero. So maybe his polio kind of, prevented him from really any sexual activity. Physical sexual activity, I should say. Here we go. Fala was not FDR's dog's original name. Fala was very famous. He was a very famous first dog. As if part of the internet generation, FDR's dog was almost more famous than he was. However, Fala was actually originally named Big Boy, then Murray, the outlaw of Fala Hill, after a Scottish ancestor. Finally, they went with Fala because you'll never get internet famous with 3 names. Let's be serious. Fala was a very cute first dog, Scottish Terrier, I believe. And Fala, and I believe his other dog's name was Chief, they're buried right behind him and Eleanor in Hyde Park, and I'll show you that when I show you the grave photos. So pretty cool stuff. Good old Fala. FDR put our book collections to shame. At the time of his death in 1945, FDR owned upwards of 21,000 books, having started collecting serious during and after his time at college. The Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum houses all of them now. If you're tired of your current reading list, his childhood favorite was Cast Up by the Sea by Sir Samuel White. FDR considered his law clerk job to be his gateway to politics. Evidently, it was the success of his cousin Teddy Roosevelt that lured FDR into a life of politics. So after he graduated from Columbia, he scored a job as a law clerk, which he later cited as the start of his political career. And I mean, at the actual job, he was bragging about his future before it even happened. Lucky for him, it turned out okay. FDR's relationship with the press is still unheard of and untouchable. FDR knew how to play the media game, and he set the tone at his first press conference on March 8th of 1933 when he shook hands with all 125 reporters present. He bantered with them for 40 minutes and gave them absolutely nothing concrete. It worked. The press adored FDR, and he held a record 998 press conferences during his terms as president. President Obama didn't even come close to that. Neither did Donald Trump, and Joe Biden won't either. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt's favorite cake was fruitcake. Proving that he and I could never share Christmas dessert, FDR's favorite cake was fruitcake. Fortunately, if you also like fruitcake and don't want to share Christmas dessert, you can channel the late president's tastes. His housekeeper, Henrietta NESBITT, wrote a cookbook called The Presidential Cookbook, feeding the Roosevelts and their guests. And you can check it out online. So there you go. Get a recipe for the fruitcake that he liked. FDR showed his gratitude through cufflinks. If you were a man of FDR's good side, you were likely to walk away with a set of cufflinks, a tradition that began during his 1920 bid for the vice presidency. As a way of saying thank you, he gave each man on the campaign a set from Tiffany's. Then the tradition continued, and soon anyone who'd earned their accessories met up every year for FDR's birthday. Pretty cool. Of course, we said he was the first president to name a woman to the cabinet. We know that. Pretty interesting stuff. So let me see here. Is there anything else I could tell you guys? We know about him, first one to fly. Yeah, all this stuff. I'm just kind of looking here. Give me a sec here to kind of look it over. Another thing I did want to touch on is while racism has never stopped being a serious issue in the history of the U.S., the first half of the 20th century was a time when many black people who had angered white people found themselves lynched by angry mobs. During his presidency, Roosevelt condemned the act of lynching as murder, but he never pushed for a law to make it explicitly illegal. He reasoned that Southern Democrats would have turned against him the instant he tried to do that, and it would have made it impossible for him to push any other bill through Congress. Of course, this didn't stop his wife, Eleanor, from supporting Republican proposals to criminalize lynching. Interesting, and one thing I did want to read is about Mary McLeod Bethune and Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt appointed Mary McLeod Bethune to a position created especially for her in the National Youth Administration, a New Deal program. As director of the NYA, Office of Minority Affairs, Mrs. Bethune became the first African-American woman to lead a federal agency in 1935. Her work with the NYA helped African-American youth find employment and opportunity during the Great Depression. Along with Mrs. Bethune, FDR appointed African-American professionals to posts throughout the federal government to implement New Deal programs for African-Americans nationally. At the time, racial discrimination barred African-Americans from cabinet-level service. However, Mrs. Bethune organized the agency's heads into a council of presidential advisors, also known as FDR's Black Cabinet. And just to touch on that, both friends and critics of the New Deal point to the actions by President FDR and the exclusion of African Americans from some programs as evidence that the New Deal was possibly racist. But in order to evaluate the New Deal fairly, we have to ask what the country was like at the time. As I just said, African Americans were not able to have cabinet positions, which is dreadful and terrible. But what I urge you to do, I'm not going to read this whole thing because it is kind of long. The bottom line is this, that FDR was definitely a good man when it came to race issues and segregation and the treatment of African Americans. And I urge you to take a look and Google FDR and his Black Cabinet and read all about the things he did. Obviously appointing, as I just said, Mrs. Bethune was a remarkable feat and something that no one had ever done beforehand. So definitely interesting and something that anybody who's interested in FDR should check out because it's very, very interesting. So another cool thing about FDR, like his fifth cousin Teddy, Franklin Roosevelt was very much in support of protecting the environment. His support for the national parks led to a sharp rise in their popularity. In 1930, around 3 million tourists visited national parks. By 1939, that yearly number had jumped up to 15.5 million. Not only that, 3.4 million young men hired by the Civilian Conservation Corps were tasked with improving the parks. Thousands of dirt roads were improved, thousands of nature trails were set up, and an incredible 2 billion trees were planted. We wouldn't be surprised if Roosevelt managed to secure the ever-coveted ENT vote because of this. ENT vote. Pretty cool stuff. I had mentioned, obviously, the assassination attempt. So, yes, it was as popular as Roosevelt has become in history. It's worth remembering that some people still hated him. One of these people was Giuseppe Zangara, a man who had spent a lifetime battling poor health, which contributed to the neurotic delusions that made him decide to murder the president. In 1933, Roosevelt happened to visit Zangara's hometown of Miami. Sitting in the back of an open car, he gave a speech to a crowd which included Zangara. However, Zangara was a mere 5 feet tall and was standing on a chair to try and get a shot at Roosevelt. He fired off 6 rounds, killing 1 person and injuring 4 others, but none of them were Roosevelt. Zangara was given the electric chair for his crime. As I told you that, he's buried down there in the Florida State Prison Cemetery. This is pretty funny. When it comes to the historical teamwork between Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, not many people think of the time that Churchill flashed Roosevelt and his son Elliot. It turns out that Churchill was a fan of being naked and surprising people with his nudity. Roosevelt was no exception to this rule. When Roosevelt once met with Churchill, he found the British Prime Minister completely naked. Churchill's response to Roosevelt's shock? "You see, Mr. President, I have nothing to hide." Well, I guess that's one way to prove it. I thought that was pretty funny. Oh man, that's funny stuff. Let me think here. Yeah, I mean it's pretty much just kind of looking, just making sure that there's nothing else. Oh, here we go. Franklin Roosevelt, it turns out, had a gift for pranks, which began in his childhood. One afternoon in 1892, Roosevelt snuck into his nurse's private chambers and poured Alka-Seltzer into her chamber pot. What people used before toilets, of course. This reacted strongly when the nurse next used her chamber pot, much to her shock. Roosevelt was later brought before his father to answer for the prank, but allegedly his father couldn't keep a straight face. After a hearty chuckle, he told his son to consider himself spanked and let him go. His love for pranking and silly jokes continued long into Roosevelt's adulthood, and if you thought being president would demand him to stop, you think again. On one occasion, he summoned reporters for an important press conference, only to introduce a farmer to give a long speech about stud bulls. Roosevelt also persuaded one of his Secret Service members to scale a farm building, only to have the ladder removed, stranding the poor guy on the roof. We're getting the feeling that Roosevelt was a big Three Stooges type fan. Pretty funny stuff. Just trying to see if there's anything else here that I would definitely want to make sure that I touched on. Oh, here we go. When Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, the story goes that he was snubbed by Adolf Hitler. However, according to Owens himself, it was actually his own president who did the real snubbing. Only white athletes were invited back to the White House to meet Roosevelt. In Owens' own words, "The president didn't even send me a telegram." For all the talk about Owens proving Hitler wrong, his own president didn't even acknowledge what he had done. Pretty crazy. Yeah. So that's not exactly a very good thing. Not very good. We know about the marriage, the failing marriage. Roosevelt. Oh, here we go. Roosevelt may never have lived long enough to lead his nation through World War II if a sinister plot against his life had been successful. In 1933, Marine Corps Major Smedley Butler was approached to join in a conspiracy to murder Roosevelt and replace him with a fascist dictator. Maybe they were inspired by a certain German man who took power that very same year. The conspirators were said to include Senator Prescott Bush, the DuPont family, and the heads of Standard Oil, GM, and Chase Bank. Luckily for Roosevelt, Butler's loyalty lay with the president. He told everything he knew to a congressional meeting the next year. Everyone he named denied their involvement, of course. While no charges were brought forward, the plot was acknowledged to have existed and was luckily halted in its early stages. Pretty interesting. So yeah, pretty crazy stuff. And yeah, that's really it. We know about the misdiagnosis of the polio. We touched on that. Just trying to see here. 1 and 2 terms. We know about polio, the New Deal. Roosevelt enacted the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, the RTAA, which was to decrease global poverty and reduce international tensions. That was something he did. He proposed Judicial Procedures Reform Bill. Obviously, that was a target at the Supreme Court justices. We know about all that. We touched on that. FDR was a proponent to the notion that the U.S. had a role to fulfill in international relations due to its status as a global power. People widely regard FDR as a humanitarian because of his efforts to help Americans during the Great Depression. But we know about what he did with the Japanese Americans, which wasn't exactly humanitarian-like. While Roosevelt's predecessor, Herbert Hoover, took the approach of non-governmental intervention when concerning the Great Depression, obviously FDR vocalized his plan. The New Deal, we know about all that. We know about the assassination attempts, the creation of the United Nations. FDR dedicated himself to free trade, believing that it would significantly enhance global economics and politics. In 1941, Roosevelt and Winston Churchill drafted the Atlantic Charter that outlined these beliefs. So, yet another thing that Roosevelt brought up and enacted. So, I mean, that's pretty much the kit and caboodle, as they say, the whole deal. And we really covered it all when it comes to FDR. Now, I know this is a long video. Instead of doing 3 parts, I'm just doing this in 2. And I know it's very long, but that's just the way it is. So, now we're going to get into, of course, the death and the burial and everything of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president. And, of course, we're going to be reading from The President is Dead by Louis Picone, the great book that I always tend to read from. So, let's get right into it. The death, the burial, the funeral, and the gravesite of FDR. Here we go. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt considered an unprecedented 4th term for president, the strain of living with polio and his 12 years in office had taken a physical toll. In March of 1944, his cardiologist gave him a thorough examination to see if he was fit to run for another term. He grimly concluded Roosevelt might only have another year to live, which would later prove remarkably precise. Undeterred, Roosevelt kept his prognosis from all but a select few, but even those who were unaware were convinced that he would not survive a 4th term. His vice presidential choice, Harry S. Truman, made a sarcastic and prophetic comment to a friend while considering the position. The vice president simply presides over the Senate and sits around hoping for a funeral. In one of their first meetings, an outdoor lunch on August 18th of 1944, Truman was stunned by Roosevelt's appearance and later confided to a friend, his hands were shaking and he talks with considerable difficulty. It doesn't seem to be a mental lapse of any kind, but physically, he's just going to pieces. Over the years, Roosevelt sought both physical and mental relief in his home at Warm Springs, Georgia. He went there on March 30th of 1945 to prepare for the conference to be held in San Francisco to establish the United Nations. On the brink of victory in World War II, Roosevelt sought peace and solitude before the next great chapter of world history. He arrived worn out and gaunt, but those who had accompanied him noted he appeared healthier as the days progressed. On Thursday, April 12th, the president slept late and awoke with a minor headache. His doctor, Navy Commander Howard G. Brune of Bethesda, Maryland, found no reason for concern and left for a swim. In his study at about 1 p.m., Roosevelt signed a bill extending the Commodity Credit Corporation. He expected later in the day to attend a barbecue at the home of Warm Springs Mayor Frank Alcorn. The president, who always enjoyed fraternizing with American citizens, had told his daughter Anna that he had grand plans of overeating, but intended to thoroughly enjoy it. His healthy appetite was taken as a good sign. Before the barbecue, he first sat by the fireplace to model for Russian artist Elizabeth Shomatov. By Roosevelt's side was his secret mistress, Lucy Mercer Rutherford, whose presence lifted his spirit. Roosevelt sat for the painting in a double-breasted charcoal suit and crimson tie and puffed on a cigarette. Suddenly, he seemed to experience a sharp pain and fumbled at his head in apparent confusion. Attempting a smile of reassurance to his guests, he said his last words, "I have a terrible headache." The president had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and minutes later slipped into unconsciousness. His valet, Arthur Prettyman, and a butler carried him into the adjoining bedroom and placed him on the small bed. Moments later, Dr. Bruin, medical aid Lieutenant George Fox, and Atlanta heart physician Dr. James Paulin were at his bedside. Bruin changed Roosevelt into his pajamas to make him more comfortable. They tried to revive him by placing camphor beneath his nose and pulling his tongue from his mouth to help him breathe. In desperation, they pumped a syringe of adrenaline into his heart, but they could not save him. At 3:35 p.m. on April 12th of 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. An autopsy was not performed, but the death certificate listed cause of death as cerebral hemorrhage with a contributory cause of arterial sclerosis. Dr. Paulin called Fred W. Patterson from the H.M. Patterson and Son Funeral Home of Spring Hill, who immediately sent 2 caskets large enough for the president's 6'3" frame to Warm Springs. So basically what happened was, obviously, Roosevelt was dead, and then they had to do everything they could to, they tried to revive him, but that just didn't work. So then there was the funeral. There was a train that carried his body back to Washington, D.C. Now, before, I get into the death sites, let me just explain to you. Roosevelt, he was put on, let me just see here, 12th was granted access. Of course, the embalming. April 13th was a beautiful spring day when the hearse began its slow drive to the train station. In the car behind the hearse rode the former First Lady and First Dog, Fala. 1,200 infantrymen from Fort Benning marched behind the 99th Infantry Ground Forces and 267th Army Ground Forces bands. At Eleanor's suggestion, they passed Georgia Hall, where Roosevelt always visited to say goodbye before he departed. At 10:01 a.m., the hearse arrived at the train station, today, which is the Warm Springs Welcome Center, where thousands of villagers had gathered. And then the train, I'm not going to read everything, but it made its way, at every station, basically, throughout the South. Black and white Americans stood together in their grief. It stopped in Atlanta. It stopped in all sorts of places. North Carolina. Eventually, after 721 and a half miles in 23 hours, the train arrived at Union Station in Washington, D.C. at 9:50 a.m. The day was hot and muggy, but still 25,000 people had gathered there. So then, there was a funeral service, an Episcopal funeral service. The service was led by Episcopal Bishop Angus Dunn from Washington, D.C. So there it was. And then, of course, his body was... The second funeral train took him to Hyde Park, New York, where he's buried at the estate there at Hyde Park, New York, the Roosevelt estate. So here we go. And interesting, a little side note I wanted to read. Almost immediately after Roosevelt's death, rumors started to spread that he was still alive, while other rumors alleged he had committed suicide. One conspiracy theorist wrote, "Until Mrs. Roosevelt explains to the world why the casket was not open to the public, the death of her husband, FDR, will remain an unsolved mystery." According to this theorist, even Russian Premier Joseph Stalin was skeptical and had suggested that an autopsy would determine if the president had been poisoned, but none was performed. Failing that, he had ordered Russian Ambassador Andrei Gromkov to go to the White House and seek a viewing of the body to confirm that Roosevelt had indeed died. Gromkov was denied his request, supporting conjecture that Roosevelt's death was more mysterious than the public was led to believe. So pretty interesting. There was actually theories that he wasn't dead. So now moving on to the locations of the death site. He purchased the land in Warm Springs, Georgia. Roosevelt did in 1926. It was known as the Little White House there, the home where he died at in Warm Springs, Georgia. I have never been to the house there. The home is located at 401 Little White House Road in Warm Springs, Georgia. I have never been there, but it is, it's a cool place. These pictures you're seeing are stock photos that I found online. They're not my photos, but that is where FDR actually died. Then the funeral car conduit was built in 1911 and had been used by Roosevelt during his lifetime. After the funeral, it was used for passenger service, but it is unknown how many of those on board knew that the same car had once carried Roosevelt's remains. In October of 1956, it was purchased by Straits Shows, a carnival operator located in Florida. In 1972, it was damaged in a flood in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and it was deemed beyond restoration and destroyed. And then, of course, the grave. The Hyde Park burial location was chosen by Roosevelt several years prior to his death. This was where he was born and where he wanted to rest forever. In 1938, Roosevelt donated the estate to the federal government with the stipulation that Eleanor and their children could live out their lives in the home. In 1944, the estate was declared a National Historic Site, and Roosevelt visited it for the last time in March of 1945, about a month before he died. After the president's death, Eleanor waived the conditions of the donation and turned over full rights to the federal government on November 21st of 1945. The grave site, it's right there on the grounds of his home in Hyde Park, New York. It's really nice. And I have a funny story real quick to tell you about it. So the very first time I ever visited Hyde Park, New York was last year in 2020 during the pandemic, and it was early on. It was like in May of 2020. Well, the grounds were closed. The library and the home there, Springwood and that sort of thing, they were all closed. And when I went, I was able to walk onto the grounds. I parked at there's a shopping center kind of right next to where the home is, the estate is. And I parked in the parking lot of that shopping center and I walked across to the grounds. Well, I, found where the garden is, where the, where the gravesite is of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. But there's a little fence around it, not a big fence, just a little. And there was kind of this, kind of makeshift lock on it. Well, it had enough give in it to where I could actually crawl underneath the fence and get into the garden to see the grave site and the tombstone. So I did that, and as I was either crawling in or out of the garden to see the grave site, my hoodie that I was wearing at the time caught the bottom of the fence in the gate and punctured a hole in my sweatshirt in my hoodie. So you're going to see a picture right now on your screen. That's of my hoodie. That's the famous hole. And I still have that hoodie. And I will not throw that hoodie away because it's almost like a war wound. Hey, look, this was from when I first visited FDR's grave. So pretty silly but funny. So I've actually been there twice now. Once by myself with the infamous hoodie story, and then once with Henry. So you're seeing pictures of both visits here on your screen. It's very pretty. And you're also going to notice, I'm going to show you with arrows, that his 2 dogs are buried right behind him. Fala, and I believe it's Chief, I believe is the other dog's name. If I'm wrong, I'll correct myself on the screen. But yes, that's where Fala is buried. And I didn't even know it. I didn't even look down. But if you look down at the actual, little stones there, it says Fala and the other dog's name. So, yes. So the actual shot of the 2 dogs' names, that's not my photo. That's a stock photo that I found online. But the other photos that you're seeing with the arrows, where I'm pointing out where the 2 dogs are buried, those are my photos. I didn't even realize his dogs were buried right there behind him. So, but there's the gravesite of Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt on their beautiful estate mansion grounds in Hyde Park, New York. That's also the building you're seeing also on your screen. That's the building that Roosevelt was born, the house that Roosevelt was born in. Springwood, I believe, is the name of the building. So there you go. It's Roosevelt's birthplace and his final resting place in Hyde Park, New York. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I love taking a look at, where these people are buried, these presidents are buried, and, if I visited where they died, the death site, the birthplace, all that stuff. I love it. So very fun stuff. I hope you enjoyed. I know this was a long video, but I hope you enjoyed the look at the life, legacy, death, funeral, and burial site of our 32nd president, the man who held the office longer than anybody in history and will hold the office longer than anybody will ever hold the office. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. So, hello, TJ with Dead History here, and I'm standing here with my son Henry, and we are actually at the iconic and pretty famous Hyde Park residence of the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that is the final resting place of President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady. Possibly, if not possibly one of the most famous First Ladies to ever live. I've been here before, of course, during my journey, but this is my son's first time being here. So, we're gonna approach the gravesite and we will check back in. TJ here with Dead History again, and I'm standing here with my son Henry, and we are standing gravesite at the grave of the 32nd President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And just wanted to show you guys. This is on the grounds of his home. One of his homes back that way, and then there's another one. There's a lot of different buildings here. Yeah, right there. Actually, I'll flip so you can kind of see. There's a lot of different buildings here. I'll show you some. And of course, here's the president's grave. And me and my son are gonna head out now, and I'll take a few seconds of video of some of the homes. But 32nd President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I meant to say that this is actually a National Park Service operated and managed park. Roosevelt's home here in Hyde Park, New York. And then of course, his gravesite sits right on the grounds here. And yeah, so Henry and I, this is Henry's first time here. This is my second. So beautiful area. I forgot to say my ending, he says. Well, we'll stop and say it now. Mr. Roosevelt, wonderful president, and now he belongs to the ages. So, approaching one of Roosevelt's homes here at Hyde Park. There's my son over there, of course, being a very typical 7-year-old. Beautiful this is. It sits right on the Hudson River. This one's called Springwood, I believe. Pretty, just really iconic place. I mean, it's just beautiful. That's just explaining about the family. It's quite beautiful. I'll get a quick view of the backyard kind of area, so you can kind of see what the setting is. Here's the backyard of one of the homes of Roosevelt, and just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful upstate New York landscape. Fall colors are in full tilt up here, but just a very beautiful, beautiful area. Not a bad view that President Roosevelt had. FDR, thank you for joining. Stay tuned. Hint, hint. There is some bonus footage, so stay tuned for that. But yes, thank you so much for the support. Thank you for everybody for everything you do. Thank you for the comments and questions. I know it's a long video, but FDR deserves 2 long videos because he's one of the greatest that we ever had. Some people have asked me if you had to choose one president to put on Mount Rushmore as a 5th face. So who would be number 5, a 5th face on Mount Rushmore? And I always tell people, if it has to be a president, if I can't pick somebody like Harriet Tubman or Martin Luther King or somebody in that kind of vein, if it has to be a president, I truly, honestly would have to pick Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was truly amazing. So, there you go, our 32nd president. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for all the support. You guys are the best. And we will see you next week for number 33, Harry S. Truman. And of course, the dropping of the atomic bomb. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, guys. See you next week. Bye-bye now. Hey, guys. TJ here. I'm still at the St. James Episcopal Churchyard here in Hyde Park, New York. It is raining a little bit. I'm going to flip you guys around again. So that's where we were over there. That's the Roosevelt family plot. That's where FDR's mother and father, a few of his children, I think there's 4 of his children are over there, plus his half-brother, Rosie Roosevelt, James Rosie Roosevelt, he's over there. And then if you kind of follow this path or just cut through, come up here, you will see over right there where we're headed. That is actually the gravesite of Miss Henrietta Nesbitt. Yes, that is FDR's White House cook. The lady who so infamously served terrible food, apparently. So this is her gravesite right here. Is this hers? That has all the water? Of course. Out of all of them that has water. Look, no water, no... This one has standing water, and this is her marker. I'm going to try to kick it off for you guys a little bit. Get some of this water out of here. Apologize for the delay. Okay, so you can read it now. It's Victoria Nesbitt. That was her real first name, Victoria. But yes, there you go. That is Mrs. Nesbitt's gravesite. This is looks like a little family plot here. There's a few Nesbitts here. But this is where Mrs. Nesbitt is buried. The woman, and isn't that kind of funny and weird and ironic and coincidental? You see all her other family members. There's really not much water, a little bit of water. But remember I said in my video that she, the food she made was infamously watery. And take a look at her gravestone. Watery, exactly like her food. So, I guess that's a little bit fitting in a way, huh? Pretty funny. So, there you go. Mrs. Nesbitt, the FDR White House cook, her gravesite right here in Hyde Park, New York. Thanks, guys. This is like crazy. The bonus footage is nuts, right? So as we say bye to Mrs. Nesbitt here behind us, kind of show you guys. Here you go, turn you around. Walking down the path here. Roosevelt family plot right over there behind those hedges. So I hope you liked it. There it is. There's the church. Hope you like this look. So this is literally like 2 miles maybe down the road from the Roosevelt estate at Hyde Park, where Roosevelt FDR was born, where he's buried, right down the road. So we might take a ride over there. So I kind of wanted to let you guys know the surprise was supposed to be, well, I was going to be doing all this as a bonus, and I was also tomorrow, which is Tuesday, June 15th, my plan was to meet up with a friend in Rhode Island and drive about another hour into Massachusetts. There's the Roosevelt plot. There's FDR's parents right there. Again, one last time. Anyway, that was the plan, to drive into Massachusetts tomorrow. Yes, about 5 hours from my house or so. To go see FDR's secretary, Mrs. LeHand. Mrs. LeHand is buried in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the very famous Mount Auburn Cemetery. And that is one of FDR's supposed mistresses. So I wanted to go see her gravesite for you guys. Plus, they have a little FDR, actually, there's a quote of FDR's on her headstone, which is really unique. And FDR also paid for her headstone and her plot. So that's another really amazing thing, right? So there you go. I wanted to do that for you guys. That was the plan. So, and I was also going to go see Lewis Howe. Lewis Howe, who was a very close confidant and friend of FDR's. He's the one that really built FDR up and kept encouraging him into politics even after his polio, came about. So he's buried in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is not too far from Cambridge. So I was going to go get both of them and add them as bonus footage. But it is supposed to, I don't know if you can see, you probably can't see. It's misting rain here in Hyde Park, New York today. Nothing bad, obviously. I'm not getting soaked. It's actually nice. It's only like 68 degrees, so it's pretty nice. But the problem is up in Cambridge, Massachusetts tomorrow, it's supposed to be like 95% chance of rain and like thunderstorms, thunder and lightning, and like a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of rain total expected. So it's supposed to like pour. So my friend and I are going to keep an eye on the weather tonight and see if it changes a little. If it does, you're going to have more bonus footage. If it does not, you're not going to have any more, fun, quirky FDR grave bonus footage. But I hope you enjoyed this at least. You got to see a lot of the Roosevelt family and such here. So, and his cook, which is cool. So, all right, guys, thanks. TJ with Dead History, check it out. And stay tuned. Maybe more bonus footage, or stay tuned for next week. See you guys. Hey guys, I'm smirking because I said to myself that I was never going to come here ever again or again or again. But I came here anyway, so. That's the gravesite right there of our 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I'm going to show you guys the reason I came back, not only because I was right down the road, but I also wanted to show you guys where Fala is. I'm the only one over here right now, so I got to kind of like sneak around because you're not really supposed to go all the way in here. So here you go. So that's where Franklin and Eleanor are, and here you go. There's Chief and there's Fala right here, and they are right behind Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt. So I'll show you the front real quick. Garden's looking nice. They're starting to get, everything's starting to bloom over here in this beautiful garden. So there is Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt. There you go. 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor. Alright guys, just want to make sure I get out of here before anybody comes and I get chased out of the garden. Thanks guys. So I did want to show you guys real quick before I end this bonus footage here. There's the gravesite again. So right back over there through the trees, you can kind of see it a little bit. That's Springwood. That's where Franklin was born, and that's the home. And then I wanted to show you this over here. If you come through the garden, right through here, you see this. This is the Presidential Library and Museum, right here. Pretty sure it's still closed right now. But here you go. Here's Franklin. Thought this was kind of cool. There you go. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then there's Winston Churchill. So, pretty fun, pretty cool. Nice bust of Mr. Churchill. So there you go. I just wanted to show you guys this. I know this wasn't in any of my photos or anything. So yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. This actually might be, I'm trying to think if that's the wall. The figure of the woman before you were cut from a large, yeah it is. This was cut from a large section of the Berlin Wall. So this is actually pieces of the Berlin Wall right here. Pretty cool. And then yeah, I mean right here, here's Franklin's bust. And you know, right over there is where he lays to rest. So thanks guys. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and I am actually here in Fall River, Massachusetts, and right there behind me, that is the grave of Lewis Howe. Let me turn you guys around. So Lewis Howe, he's kind of known as the man who made FDR, lifelong friend and confidant, and he's the guy that was with FDR when he was first diagnosed with polio, and he's kind of a big encouragement for FDR to continue in politics. So here he is in Fall River, Massachusetts, same cemetery as Lizzie Borden, who I've already seen in the past, but there you go, Lewis Howe. Another FDR bonus for you guys. Thanks guys. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and I am in the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's actually Thursday, June 17th, so you will be seeing this video tomorrow, this bonus footage. And right here behind me, I'm going to flip you guys around, because right there, around, this is actually Missy LeHand's gravesite. Marguerite Missy LeHand, and she was obviously FDR's secretary, and you actually can see here, I'm trying to get it out of the shadow. She was utterly selfless in her devotion to duty to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said that, obviously. So Got a quote by FDR, and FDR actually paid for her funeral and for her gravestone. So Franklin paid for this, and she was actually in Franklin Roosevelt's will, but she actually died before he did. So he was going to provide for her in his will, but she passed away before he did. And Eleanor Roosevelt actually attended her funeral here. So there you go, FDR's secretary, Missy LeHand. Gravesite here in Mount Auburn, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thanks, guys.